Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Xhul'horac on Mythic.
So this encounter is pretty difficult, but not for the reasons you may well think. The DPS requirement isn't very high, nor really is the healing requirement. It's just instead you do need to deal with both mini-bosses, so from phase 1 you'll have Achillean, and from phase 2 you'll have Ominous, at the exact same time from very early on in the encounter. And when both mini-bosses die, Xhul'horac will actually gain their signature abilities and create new versions of them that are empowered, and therefore harder to deal with.
Now there is hundreds of different ways of dealing with this fight, so we're going to be going over the one that we did, and for this particular strat, comp is very important. In pretty much all strats, comp is super important, and it could halve your progression time by simply stacking the correct classes. Now you can 2 or 3 tank this fight. Having all the adds up as well as the boss can make taunt swapping confusing or difficult, and any Shadowfell annihilations on the raid can be lethal. Having the mini bosses and the boss up at the same time also gives you a bucket load of damage that you need to deal with. Now you can easily 3-heal this fight if you play correctly, but it's a good idea to 4-heal it for safety. Healers with damage reduction cooldowns are great for the last phase, and if you can bring multiple disc priests, that's a great luxury. It's not essential by any means, but it is awesome. Disc Priest can single-handedly carry the last phase, as well as providing speed shields for Fell Surge and Void Surge targets.
Now in terms of your DPS composition, you'll need to keep a few things in mind. The wild pyromaniacs that spawn, which of course is the imps, they need to die incredibly fast. Their cast time on Mythic is significantly reduced, and at all costs you need to make sure that they never get a successful one off. If you can bring at least 2 Death Knights, you'll pretty much be laughing, because on the first set of imps you can mass grip them, on the second set of imps you can mass grip them again, and on the third set of imps you can get a Death Knight to individually grip each individual imp on top of the last imp that is closest to melee, which means they're all stacked, and having them stacked makes them a hell lot easier to kill because you can just cleave them down, but it also makes it a lot easier to interrupt them with AoE stuns and things like boomkin beams. By the time the 4th imp spawned, your first Death Knight will actually have his mass grip back with cooldown, and you can just repeat from there. Now, if you don't have the DKs available to do this, you'll have to organize your interrupts very specifically, and you'll have to position your melee in such a way so that the tank that is receiving the void damage from the void strike from the boss and from the damage from Ominous is never hit from an accidental bolt. So melee need to position themselves in between the minions and the tank, because you do not want a Shadowfell annihilation to go off. But realistically, as long as everyone swaps to the imps immediately and their first cast is interrupted, you shouldn't really have any other issues. They should die before the second one comes in.
Now the Void Fiends that spawn also have a decreased cast time, and therefore they also need to die very quickly. If you can have at least 2 hunters in your raid, you can easily pick them up, and they're certainly the best class for the job. Now black holes will spawn early on into the fight, and from that point they'll start to come in every 60 seconds. The damage they deal on Mythic is insane, so you'll need multiple people to soak them all at the same time. This is difficult to do and requires a lot of coordination. Now black holes can sometimes also spawn within fell fire patches. This means you need to run through fire and go and soak it, so you'll be fell touched, and when you take the black hole damage you'll be hit by shadow damage, and that'll proc a Shadowfell annihilation and is very likely to kill anyone that is soaking it. However, you can easily cheese the situation with rogues. If you can bring 3 rogues, again, you will be laughing. If a rogue cloaks before going inside, they'll be immune to both Fell and Void touched. They will, however, still take an insane amount of damage and be one hit. However, if you run with cheat death, you can just rotate your 3 rogues to take each and every one and you'll be absolutely sorted. Now for black holes not inside Fellfire, you can instead use warlocks using all of their giant shield crazy warlock shit that they have, and you could even use a DK purgatory and get your healers to precast the damage. Just remember that most damage reductions and immunities are pretty much ineffective, so you're very limited to what class you can use to cheese this ability. If you cannot set up a rotation of 3 players, you are forced to instead soak as a group of at least 5 players. Just make sure you're not fell touched when you soak. But overall, just try and avoid group soaking as much as you can. It's just really messy. Having someone log a shit geared ult that's a rogue is a much better solution than group soaking.
Now chains that come in from Achillean can also be a real pain to deal with, but again, bring the right composition and you can easily cheese it. When the chains are being cast on you, if you actually feign death or spectral guise or invis, the boss will stop the cast on you and begin to recast the chains on a brand new target. When the boss is picking the target, he'll always prioritize players that are stood far away from the boss. So if you can somehow get this to land on a mage or someone with an immunity such as a paladin, they can get the cast to finish on them and also completely remove the chain by, as you may have guessed, immunity. But mages can also evidence it off, which is amazing since it's such a low cooldown. Now this isn't really super important in the earlier parts of the fight where only Achillean is targeting it, but in the later stages of the fight when it is empowered by Xhul'horac and Xhul'horac himself is casting it, it's very beneficial that you can do this, and we'll explain how the empowerment works later. Just keep in mind, mages are fucking awesome, bring as many as you can. So in short, you can either bring 2 or 3 tanks. We personally 3 tanked our first kill. You want to bring 3 or 4 healers. We personally, again, used 4 healers. We did, in fact, use 2 discs. You want to bring at least 2 Death Knights if you can. 3 rogues is absolutely insane. You want to bring at least 1 hunter and as many mages as you possibly can. But apart from that,
you can just bring what you want. You get to decide that one last spot. Should it be a warlock? Should it be a boomkin? Yeah, there's a lot that you need to do in this fight. So let's actually get on with what's going on in this fight, and we'll start with phase 1. On the pool, we drag the boss to the right hand side of the room, and the idea is, by the time the fight is over, the boss is on the left hand side of the room. This strat involves getting the Hellfire and the Voidfire to blow each other up, rather than having players manually do it themselves. Every time the boss casts Fel Surge, it is applied to 5 random players. Note to Death Knights, if you AMS the cast, you can immune the Fel Surge application, and rogues you can actually cloak it off. Players with Fel Surge run and place them stacked on a set location on the edge of the room. The dot applied to you from the fire doesn't actually deal a lot of damage, so you're safe to stack on top of old fires. This makes far less fires spawn compared to spreading the Fel Surges out. Get your Disc Priest to run speed shields so targets can actually get there without any issues, especially people like melee who have to run further. Now when the imps spawn, make sure you grip them under the boss and keep them interrupted and kill them off as soon as you possibly can. Now Achillean will spawn at 90%. If you are 2 tanking, make sure that one of your tanks has both the boss and Achillean. If you're 3 tanking, have one of your tanks have Achillean only. Achillean's flurry attack deals crazy high magic damage, so make sure you have something every time it is coming in. Now if you can cheese the chain cast, do so, but don't waste any long cooldown immunities on it because you'd rather have it for the empowered version.
At 85%, the boss will kick into phase 2, and this is when he'll start switching between the Fel and Void version of himself, so tanks you need to make sure you swap accordingly. And also, of course, once he's in Void, he'll also start spawning his Void ads, the Void Fiends, and he'll also start doing Void Surges. Now, the way that we actually deal with a Void Surge is that as soon as it goes out on a player, we have that player run towards the Fel Surge fire and place the Void Patches as close to it as you possibly can. Ideally, when you are doing this, you'll want them to not instantly meet and explode, otherwise the Void Surge player, or anyone within 20 yards of that player, will also take Annihilation damage as well as the Annihilation stack that increases the amount of damage you take from future Annihilations. However, the way that the Shadow Patches spawn is kinda random, and it's relatively hard to predict, so it's likely that while you are progressing this boss, it will happen at some point. The only advice we can really give to you when you're doing this is just make sure you're not obviously right on top of the patch or right next to it. Just make sure there's a little gap, maybe 1 or 2 fires apart. But it's also important that you don't stand too far away because you do want them to meet ideally before the next Fel Surges come in. If for whatever reason it did spawn in a relatively shit place, you can just have one of your players go out there, get Fel touched and run into the Void, or get Void touched and run into the Hellfire. You can do that. You don't even need to use a damage reduction, providing you have no stacks. So do that if it is really, really bad. But if you do it properly, you should never have to do that at all. You just want to try and keep all fires at bay and make them as small as possible for as long as possible. You need to maximize the amount of room for the last phase. We generally place the Void Surges on one side of the main Fel Surge patch, and then that way if anyone does have Fel Surge, they can move to the opposite side, because in some situations you can move over to drop your Fel Surge, and the patches will meet at the exact same time, which means you're going to get an explosion on you. If you move to the opposite side, that way you're out of range if there is an explosion.
Now every time the Void Fiends spawn, we move from one side of the boss to the other and leave a single hunter to pick them up and kite them around. It is very important that all of your ranged DPS swap to them, as the hunter will need to be back in the raid ready to pick up the next set of Void Fiends. Now at 80%, Omnus will spawn. You'll need to have your non-Fel Touch tank pick him up, as he will immediately cast his channel, giving you Void Touched. Now if you are 2 tanking it, it can be tricky to both taunt the boss for the Void Strikes as well as taunting Omnus as he spawns, simply because of the cooldown on taunt. Also, when Omnus spawns, he'll immediately start his black hole timer, and if you get a black hole spawn at the exact same time as certain other abilities going on, such as like Fel Surges, it can become extremely messy. Now if you find yourself in this situation where either of these issues occur, consider stopping your DPS at the 85% mark and then pushing the boss below 80% at a later point to align the timers better. There is no super rush to quickly nuke down the boss in this fight, it's better that you get the timers correct. So in this phase, while the majority of your raid is moving from side to side every time a set of Void Fiends are spawning, you'll also want to have a group of ranged players set up further away than the rest of the raid. We have this particular group stood towards where the boss initially spawns. Now this group has two jobs. They're there to bait out and cheese any chains, as well as to bait out any black holes, as black holes will always try and spawn on targets that are far away from the boss. This group normally consists of any leftover hunters, priests, as well as all of your mages. Spawning the black holes in this area of the room is great because ideally there should be absolutely no fell surge fire here unless something's gone horribly wrong. However, do note that these players can in fact get fell surge, so they do need to be ready to move great distances in order to place them in decent location. Also note that these players can have Void Fiends spawn on them, and having that extra hunter or two in that group is great because they can just kite them around. If not, whoever just happens to be near the Void Fiend will have to kite it themselves.
So once you've got that set up, you just continue the fight. You want your tanks to swap between Fel and Void just so they don't get any annihilations, and of course to tank whichever ad is their touch type. You want to grip and just destroy the imps when they spawn. You want to move from side to side every time the Void Fiends spawn, and of course destroy them as well. You want to stack the Fel Surges on top of old Fel Surge fires. You want to place the Void Surges in locations where the fires will easily meet and clear each other, and you want to cheese the chains as much as you can and soak the black holes. And as the fight goes on, more and more fire will start to spawn unless you've been insane and somehow managed to clear it, and you'll see yourself slowly moving across the room.
Now once Akhelion dies, the boss will gain his chains ability, but in an empowered form. This new empowered chain will target a single player on a long cast, and once the cast is finished, it will tether that player to the two closest players. This for some reason also tethers you to dead people. You do with that what you want. Now the chain deals higher ticking damage, but it also deals a massive amount of damage to all players affected by the chain when an individual breaks away from it. The player who breaks it also deals a large amount of AoE damage to nearby targets, like within 3 or 4 yards or something, so make sure you're not breaking into a group. Now this is where your cheese comes into play. Having the empowered Fel chain land on Mage's Evidence or Paladin Bubbles makes it a lot easier than actually having to deal with it. When the boss casts this chain, it should always go to one of the players in that ranged camp that was dealing with all the black holes and things before. By having Hunters, Fane, and Shadow Priest guys, you should be able to force the boss to target a new player, and hopefully that new player is a mage or a paladin, so then they can remove it. Having these extra Hunters and Priests out there also allows extra time for Evidence to come back off cooldown, and if you don't have enough players out there, the boss can just randomly target it on pretty much anyone. If you have a lot of mages, maybe 3 or 4 of them, you don't really need that many extra classes out. Just note that mages can also invis the cast to force the boss to target a new player if Evidence is on cooldown. So if you do get unlucky, you can just keep bouncing it around. We've bounced it around for 15-20 seconds before, and we've been very lucky, and it's really worth doing. If you somehow do manage to actually get a chain cast to land on a player that doesn't have an immunity, don't panic. If you immediately break these chains, you might as well just wipe because you're going to die very, very quickly. You need to communicate and slowly, one by one, break your chain. You do, however, need to keep an eye on your health. Give healers time to top people between breaks, as you will drop very, very low. It's also a great idea to use large damage reductions or even external cooldowns just to prevent these players from being destroyed. Apart from that, everything else remains the same, except it's likely that you're around halfway across the room because of the fire at this point.
Now once Omnus dies, Xhul'horac will start casting his empowered black holes. Now the way that these black holes work is that they do slightly more damage, but on top of that, when you soak them, they also put a debuff on you that increases the amount of damage you take from future empowered black holes by a lot. And this debuff lasts 3 minutes. So if you had your rotation of 3 players, for example your 3 rogues or warlocks or whatever, it's not actually a big deal. It doesn't really change anything. But if you're group soaking, it's just going to be even more difficult, and you would have to set up a rotation of 3 separate groups.
You might as well just start sacking people at this point, to be honest.
It'd be easier just to individually send players in just to kill themselves.
Yeah.
But if you do have your 3 players cheesing instead, just make sure that maybe they have extra shields on top of them, so cows or anything like that should be good, just so they don't die. And from this point onwards, you just want to get the boss to 20% as soon as you possibly can. Everything in the fight remains the same. However, before transitioning into this last phase, you'll want to make sure that you've just killed off a set of ads. You do not want to enter the last phase with a load of ads up. It'll just be really, really messy, and you want as much damage to be going on the boss rather than on other targets. Now once you've made the transition and you are in the last phase, you'll notice very quickly how much more damage Overwhelming Chaos, that's the damage that hits the raid every 10 seconds and becomes higher and higher, you'll notice how much stronger it is compared to Heroic. And really on Mythic, you don't really want to have much more than 6 of them. I think on our initial kill we had 7, and while we were progressing we occasionally saw the 8th.
Yeah.
Those later ones end up one-shotting you. And as you may have imagined, you will need to assign your healer cooldowns for every single one you possibly can. But note, for the first 2, you don't really need to use anything, so save your strongest cooldowns for the later ones. If you manage to bring 2 Disc Priests to this fight, just have them pick 2 groups each and simply spam shields, because if you do it correctly, you can actually have the entire raid have a shield on them before the overwhelming chaos comes in, which is just incredibly useful. Do note in this phase, you still will have to do all the Fel Surge and the Void Surge. You just need to make sure you do what you've done throughout the entire fight, just by placing them on top of old ones. But also keep in mind that while you do have Fel Surge and you do have Void Surge, you can actually get hit by overwhelming chaos at the same time. There are a couple of nasty overlaps. And if you don't have any damage reduction up, or if you don't have a decent shield, or if there's no raid cooldown going up, this is pretty much lethal in all cases. So you need to make sure that either one, your healers have absolutely insane spot healing, so they're healing you while you're running out, or you need to have some sort of personal cooldown up, or you need to use something like an Aura Mastery. Also in this last phase, you will still have the empowered chains and the empowered black holes. You need to deal with them the exact same way. Healers, you just need to keep in mind that the players that are dealing with the chains, so your hunters, your mages, your priests, they are going to be out of the raid. They will not be under the boss, which means they won't be receiving much or any AoE healing whatsoever, so you might need to spot heal them more than the rest of the raid. But ultimately in this last phase, the most important thing is that once the boss does hit 20%, you use your ring, you use Bloodlust, you use a second pot, you want to make sure all your cooldowns have been saved up for this moment, and the idea is that you kill him before he kills you, which is probably going to be around the 7th overwhelming chaos. If you nail your cooldown usage properly and manage to deal the chains of the black holes without anyone panicking, and you've had great fire from the start of the fight, you should have plenty of room, and should be a pretty easy kill from that point, really.
Yeah, a couple of things with the last phase as well is that if you do get the chains on you as well, half of the time if the boss is about to die, just don't break them. Yeah. Sit in the chain. You'll probably die from dot damage eventually. Just keep nuking the boss if it's really, really early on. There is times where we have had the empowered chain go off in the last phase and we've still managed to deal with it, but most of the time it's worth just sitting there, nuking the boss, and collecting your purples. So thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide did help you out, then make sure you drop us a like. It helps us out a lot, and we'll see you in the next video.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.